The first sound Eli Calloway heard after 3 years of nothing but wind and cattle, and the grinding silence of grief, was a woman's voice drifting across the dry Texas air like something he had almost forgotten existed in this world. He had been crouched beside the water trough on the eastern edge of his property, checking for cracks in the old wood where the water had started to seep through, when the voice came to him on a warm gust of September wind. It was 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was a hard, sun-scorched land that asked no favors of anyone and gave none in return. Eli had come here 3 years ago after burying his wife and infant son in a churchyard in Abilene, and he had chosen this particular stretch of land precisely because no one came out this far. The nearest town, a small collection of buildings called Harlow Creek, sat 11 miles to the south. He had built his homestead with his own hands, worked his cattle alone, and spoken to no human being more than a handful of words for longer than he could clearly remember. But now there was a voice. It was not a shout. It was not a scream of distress, though there was urgency in it, something clipped and deliberate that made him straighten up from the trough immediately, his hand going to the revolver at his hip out of pure reflex. He stood 6'2" in his boots, broad across the shoulders from years of ranching, with dark hair that had grown longer than he liked and a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. His eyes were the pale gray of winter sky, and people who had once known him said they used to carry warmth in them. He did not think about what they carried now. He walked around the side of the barn to look toward the road, which was little more than 2-wheel ruts cutting through the sun-hardened earth, and he saw a wagon that had shed one of its rear wheels. The wheel had come off completely and was resting some distance away in the scrub brush. The wagon listed heavily to one side, and a woman stood beside it, speaking firmly and calmly to a mule that had gotten its harness tangled in its own startled panic when the wheel gave way. She was talking to the mule. Not crying, not panicking, not standing in the road wringing her hands. She was talking to the animal with a kind of patient, steady authority that Eli recognized immediately as the voice of someone who knew how to manage creatures larger and more stubborn than herself. "Easy now," she was saying, her voice low and even and carrying a slight musical quality even in its practicality. "Easy. I know it is frightening, but you are not hurt, and I am going to fix this, and I need you to stand still while I do." The mule, remarkably, was listening. Eli stood at the corner of his barn and watched for a moment longer than he should have. He was out of the habit of people, out of the habit of conversation, and some part of him, the part that had grown comfortable in isolation, wanted to retreat back to the trough and leave well enough alone. But the wagon wheel was 30 feet from the wagon and the sun was already tilting past noon, and there was no one else on this road for miles. He could not leave a woman stranded out here. Whatever he had become in 3 years of silence, he was not that. He walked toward her. She heard his boots on the dry ground and turned before he was within speaking distance, which told him she was paying attention to her surroundings even while managing the animal. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with chestnut brown hair pinned up under a bonnet that had gone slightly crooked in the commotion. Her eyes were a warm, deep amber, the color of good honey held up to light, and her face was oval-shaped with a strong jaw and a mouth that was currently set in an expression of determined composure. She was not particularly tall, but she held herself straight in a way that made her seem like she occupied more space than she actually did. She looked at him steadily without flinching, which he noted. "Good afternoon," she said, and even those 2 words, formal and composed as they were, had that same quality he had heard from across the field. There was something in her voice that was not simply pleasant. It moved through the air differently than silence did. It filled a space. Eli realized he had not responded and that a normal human amount of time for a greeting had already passed. He cleared his throat. "Afternoon," he said. His own voice came out rougher than he intended, scraping a little at the edges, like a door that had not been opened in a long time. "Wheel came off," she said, nodding toward the listing wagon with a completely unnecessary degree of calm, given that this was obviously visible to anyone with functioning eyes. He thought she might be using the mundane observation to give him time to come to himself, and that small consideration made him feel briefly and uncomfortably seen. "I can see that," he said. "I've got tools in the barn. I can help you get it back on." She nodded once, decisive. "Thank you. I appreciate that very much." She was still talking to the mule with one hand resting lightly on the animal's flank, a steady, grounding contact, while she watched Eli go for his tools. He came back with a jack and the right wrench and found that she had already calmed the mule completely and was inspecting the wheel hub to assess the damage herself. She had not waited for him to take over. She was already working the problem. "Axle bolt worked itself loose," she said, turning the bolt over in her fingers and showing it to him. "I should have checked it before I left Harlow Creek this morning. That is entirely my fault." "These roads shake everything loose eventually," Eli said, crouching down to look at the hub. "Where are you headed?" She paused just a fraction of a second before answering, which was too brief to mean anything sinister but was just long enough for him to notice. "The old Devereux homestead, about 4 miles north of your property, I believe." He looked up at her then. "The Devereux place has been empty for 2 years. 3, she said. "I purchased it from the county land office 6 weeks ago. I have come to settle it." He was quiet for a moment, fitting the jack under the axle. "That is rough land up there. The water table is low and the soil has caliche running through it." "I know," she said. She did not say it defensively. She said it the same way she had said everything so far, as though she was simply reporting a fact she had already accounted for. He worked the jack until the axle lifted, and she moved without being asked to steady the wagon frame from the other side, bracing her hands against the wood and leaning her weight in. She was stronger than she looked. They got the wheel back on together, him working the bolt with the wrench while she held tension, and he was sharply aware of how long it had been since he had worked alongside another person, how strange and oddly right it felt, like a muscle memory resurfacing. When the wheel was secured and he lowered the jack, he stood and found her brushing dust from her skirts with brisk, efficient movements. She looked up at him. "Eliza Harte," she said, extending her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "Eli Calloway." "Eli," she said, as though she was placing the word carefully in some internal ledger. "Thank you, Eli. I would have managed, but it would have taken considerably longer." "I don't doubt it," he said, and he meant it plainly without flattery. Something shifted in her expression then, just slightly. Not quite a smile, but the near approach of one. She seemed to decide against it and moved to climb back up onto the wagon seat instead. "I expect we will be neighbors then," she said, gathering the reins. "Appears so," he said. She clicked her tongue at the mule and the wagon began to roll forward, and Eli stood in the road and watched it go until the dust it kicked up settled back to the earth, and there was nothing left but the flat, empty land and the enormous afternoon sky, and the sound of wind moving through the scrub grass. He was surprised to realize his heart was beating faster than it should have been for a man who had simply helped fix a wheel. He did not sleep well that night, which was not unusual. He had not slept well in 3 years. But the reason was different this time, and he was aware of the difference even as he lay on his back in the dark listening to the wind against the boards of his house. He kept hearing that voice. Easy now. That patient, unhurried steadiness. He told himself it was simply because he was not used to hearing voices at all, and that the novelty of it had disrupted his equilibrium. This was a reasonable explanation, and he committed himself to it. He lasted 4 days before he rode north. He did not have a particular reason. He had ridden up near the Devereux land before, checking on a stray steer he sometimes lost up in those coulees. That was a plausible reason. He told himself this as he saddled his horse in the gray early morning light and pointed the animal north. His horse, a steady bay gelding he called Cedar, seemed entirely unbothered by the change in their usual route and moved through the cool morning air at an easy walk. He smelled the smoke before he saw the homestead. It was wood smoke, clean and purposeful, someone burning off scrub brush to clear ground. When he crested the low rise that looked down onto the Devereux property, he pulled Cedar up and looked down at what he saw below him, and what he saw was considerable. She had been here 4 days, and she had already cleared a significant portion of the yard around the house. The old Devereaux structure was a 2-room adobe and timber construction that had been sound when it was built, but had spent 3 empty years collecting dirt and wind damage. Already there was a pile of discarded materials beside the house where she had apparently pulled rotted boards from the porch. The brush she was burning was piled in a cleared ring on the south side of the property, a safe distance from the structure. She was moving around the fire with a long-handled tool, keeping the burn contained. Eli rode down. She looked up when she heard Cedar's hooves and raised a hand in greeting, not stopping her work. He dismounted and tied the horse to the old fence post that was still standing near the gate. "Calloway," she said. "I had a steer wander up this way," he said. She glanced at him briefly. Her expression said she was politely accepting this explanation without necessarily believing it entirely, which made him feel unreasonably transparent. "I have not seen any cattle," she said. "But there is a break in the fence on the north end of the property. He could have gone through there." "I'll check," he said. He stood there another moment. "How is the house?" "Better than I feared," she said, pulling a burning branch back into the pile with her rake. "The adobe walls are intact." The interior had some animal habitation that required addressing, but the structure is sound. The porch will need rebuilding. The well is low but producing. "You done all this in 4 days by yourself?" 3.5, she said. "I arrived at noon the first day." He looked at the cleared ground, the fire, the piled debris from the porch. It was a significant amount of work. "Where are you from, Miss Harte?" "Originally from Tennessee," she said. "More recently from Fort Worth." "What brought you all the way out here?" She was quiet for a moment, tending the fire. The pause was not evasive. It had the quality of someone choosing their words honestly rather than quickly. "I needed land of my own," she said, "and I needed to be somewhere that required me to be capable because I am capable, and I would rather that count for something than be inconvenient." He did not quite know what to make of that. "Were you farming before, in Fort Worth?" "No," she said. "I was teaching school, but I grew up on a farm in Tennessee. My father taught me everything about working land before I was 12 years old." She looked at him then directly with those honey-amber eyes. "I know what I am doing out here, Mr. Calloway. I want to be clear about that because I suspect you might be wondering." "I wasn't questioning it," he said. "You had that look," she said. "What look?" "The one where a man is doing arithmetic in his head about whether a woman alone out here is going to be a problem," she said, without any particular heat, just stating it. He felt heat rise unexpectedly at the back of his neck, not anger, something more like embarrassment, which was a sensation he had largely forgotten. "You're right that I was thinking it," he said. "I apologize." She looked at him for a moment with something that might have been surprise, as though the apology was not what she had expected, and then she nodded. "Accepted," she said, "and I appreciate the honesty." They were quiet for a moment, watching the fire burn down. The morning was cool and the smoke rose in a clean white column into the pale sky. "Your fence on the north end," he said. "If you want, I can help you repair it. I have wire and posts at the ranch." "I would pay you for the materials," she said immediately. "The materials aren't worth talking about," he said. "If your fence stays broken, my cattle will wander through. It's mutual benefit." She considered this with the same unhurried deliberateness she seemed to apply to everything. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He found the steer in the north coulee, just as she had said, and drove it back south before the morning was fully warm. He did not stop at her place again on his way back, though he was aware as he rode past of the smoke still rising and the sounds of work coming from the old house. He started sleeping slightly better after that, which seemed to him to be completely unrelated to having talked to her, and he told himself so firmly. The fence repair happened the following Saturday, which Eli spent telling himself was simply a convenient time, not a planned occasion. He arrived with cedar posts loaded in his wagon and a roll of barbed wire, and found Eliza already waiting at the north fence line with a post-hole digger in her hands, her bonnet tied firmly against the morning wind that was picking up off the plains. She had brought out a jar of cold water and 2 cups, which she set on the fence rail, and that small provision of his comfort made something tighten briefly in his chest that he promptly ignored. They worked through the morning, digging post holes and setting posts and stretching wire, and she did not falter or slow down, and did not ask to rest before he suggested it. She knew how to handle the post hole digger in the hard caliche soil, and she had clearly done this kind of work before. He found himself watching her hands when she worked, which was not something he had expected to find himself doing. As the sun climbed toward noon, she said, without looking up from where she was tamping earth around a post, "You do not talk much." "No," he agreed. "Has it been that way long?" He considered the question and gave it the honest answer she seemed to call out of him. 3 years or so. She looked at him then, not with pity, which he could not have tolerated, but with something more careful than that. Something that simply acknowledged the weight of what 3 years of silence implied. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "My wife and son," he said. He did not know why he said it. He had not said it to anyone since the priest at the burial. Fever, 1875. She set down the digger and straightened and looked at him with those steady amber eyes and said nothing for a moment, and somehow the silence she offered him then was different from all the silence he had been living in. This silence held him. "Their names?" she asked. He blinked. No one had asked him that. "Clara," he said, "and Thomas." He was 3 days old. "Clara and Thomas," she said, as if speaking their names had value in itself, as if it was a thing worth doing. Something moved through him that he could not name and did not try to. "You?" he asked, because he needed to redirect and also because he genuinely wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment and he thought she might not answer, but then she said, "I was engaged in Fort Worth 2 years ago." He decided that a woman who preferred to argue with him about the management of her own affairs was not the kind of woman he wanted to marry. She said it simply, but he heard beneath the simplicity a quieter thing, something that had cost her. "His loss," Eli said. She looked at him with a flicker of surprised warmth, and this time she did smile, briefly but fully, and it changed her face completely. It was the first time he had seen it, and he was not entirely prepared for it. They ate lunch sitting on the tailgate of his wagon, bread and dried meat she had brought and the cold water from the jar, and they talked more than either of them had apparently talked in some time. She told him about teaching school in Fort Worth, 32 children in one room, the stubborn joy she had found in watching a child discover that letters made sounds that made words that made meaning. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming to Texas with Clara because she had wanted wide land and open sky, about the fact that he had stayed after because there was nowhere else that felt like a place he had made rather than a place he had merely arrived. By the time the fence was finished in the late afternoon, he was aware that he had said more words in one day than he had said in the past several months combined, and the alarming thing was that he did not feel drained by it. He felt, in some cautious and tentative way, lighter. He did not examine this too closely. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed between them that neither of them planned and neither of them named. He found reasons to ride north. She found reasons to ride south. She appeared at his place one morning with a question about the water rights on her property, which he answered as best he could from memory. And she stayed to have coffee, which he made very badly, and she did not comment on the quality but drank it without complaint, and that small grace seemed to him to indicate something about her character. He appeared at her place to check on the porch rebuild progress and ended up staying to help set the new beams, which required a second pair of hands and which she had been managing through a combination of improvised props and what appeared to be sheer determination. He showed her the trick of bracing the beam at an angle before fitting it to the joint, and she watched him do it once and then replicated it perfectly on the next beam without instruction. "You are a fast learner," he said. "I had a very good teacher when I was a girl," she said. "My father believed that learning how to do a thing properly was more important than learning it quickly. He was right. He sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I ever knew," she said softly. "He died 4 years ago. My mother moved to live with my sister in Memphis. I taught school for 2 years after that, and then I bought this land." She paused, setting a nail with precise, confident taps of her hammer. "There was nothing left in Fort Worth that was mine. I needed something to be mine." "I understand that," Eli said, and he meant it with more weight than the words carried on the surface. She looked at him, and there was something between them in that moment that was neither the easy comfort of what they had built in the past weeks nor quite what it was becoming, but it was visible, present, undeniable, hovering in the afternoon air like heat off dry ground. He looked away first. He went back to the beams. The trouble began on a Tuesday in October, when Eliza rode to Harlow Creek to register an adjustment to her land claim at the county land office and encountered Gerald Prout. Prout was not technically a dangerous man. He was the kind of man who was dangerous in a smaller, meaner way, the kind who used legality and connection the way others used force. He was 43 years old and owned the largest cattle operation in that part of Texas, and had a habit of acquiring adjacent land when its owners found the going too difficult to continue. He had assumed the Devereux property would eventually come to him at a low price, as the county had been managing it. The fact that it had instead been sold to a woman from Fort Worth irritated him in a way that felt personal, even though it was purely about acreage and water access. Eliza came back to her homestead that evening, with a particular set to her jaw that Eli had come to recognize as her composed face being deployed over something that was genuinely upsetting her. He was there when she rode in because he had been helping her cut and stack wood for winter, and he had stayed later than intended because the conversation had been good and the work had gone well, and he admitted privately to himself, reluctant to leave. "What happened?" he asked when he saw her face. She dismounted and tied her horse to the post and turned to look at him. "Gerald Prout visited the land office while I was there," she said. "He made it very clear, to me and to everyone else present, that he considers this piece of land to be ultimately his, and that he is prepared to be patient about acquiring it." Eli felt something harden and settle in him. "Prout has been working this kind of strategy for years," he said. "He pressures people until they can't afford to keep fighting him. He hasn't touched my land because I am large enough to be inconvenient, but he has taken smaller holdings. He suggested that the conditions out here are particularly harsh for someone in my situation," Eliza said, and though her voice was steady, her hands, he noticed, were not. They were tight on the reins she had not yet looped. He was very courteous about it. He smiled the entire time. "What did you say to him?" She paused, and then something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but had the fierce edge of one. "I told him that I had purchased this land legally, registered my claim properly, and had every intention of working it for the next 40 years, and that if he had anything further to say to me about my property he could do so through the county sheriff." Eli looked at her. "In front of everyone in the land office." "Every single person," she said. He felt something that was entirely inappropriate to the situation, which was the impulse to laugh, and he controlled it with some effort. "Good," he said instead. "I am not afraid of him," she said, and he believed her. But he also saw the way she set down the reins and pressed her hands briefly against her skirts to still them. She was not afraid of Prout, but she was aware that he was a real problem. "He will try to find something to bring against your claim," Eli said. "That is his method. He looks for irregularities in the filing, or he puts pressure on whoever processes your paperwork. You need to have everything absolutely in order." "It is in order," she said. "I was very careful." "I know," he said. "I am just saying he will look." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you know Sheriff Aldis well?" "Jim Aldis," Eli said. "Well enough. He is honest. He is also limited in what he can do if Prout stays within the letter of the law." "Then I will simply have to make sure I am operating so cleanly that he has nothing to work with," she said. She untied her horse and led it toward the lean-to she had built as a temporary stable. "Thank you for the wood." He walked to his own horse. "Eliza," he said, and she paused and looked back at him, which was the first time he had used her given name without thinking about it first. He noted it himself, a fraction of a second late. "If Prout causes you real trouble, come to me." She was quiet for a moment. "I can manage my own affairs," she said, and there was an edge in it. "I know you can," he said. "I am offering as a neighbor, not because I think you need a man to fix things. Because you would be a fool not to use every resource available to you, and I am a resource." She seemed to chew on that for a moment. Then, "All right," she said. "Thank you, Eli." He rode home in the early dark and sat at his kitchen table for a long time without lighting the lamp, thinking about the way she had looked in the land office. He was constructing it from what she had told him, standing in front of Prute with her hands loose at her sides and her voice steady and measured, telling a powerful and vindictive man exactly where the boundary was. He thought about Clara, who had been a gentle and sweet-natured woman that he had loved deeply and still grieved, and he thought about how she and Eliza were entirely different kinds of people, and how love, if that was what this was beginning to be, did not apparently have a single form. He was startled by his own thought. He held it carefully, turned it over, and set it aside without denying it. He started sleeping better in October than he had slept since Abilene. November brought cold and wind and the first serious frost, and with it, a development that nobody in the area had expected. Gerald Prute's man, a lawyer who had come up from San Angelo, filed a challenge against Eliza's land claim. The challenge alleged that there was a clerical error in the original sale documentation from the county, specifically that the land boundaries had been incorrectly described, and that the parcel as described overlapped with land that had previously been registered to a Prute subsidiary company. It was, everyone who looked at it agreed, a carefully constructed lie. But it was a carefully constructed lie on paper, and it would take time and money to disprove it. Eli found out from Sam Holt, who ran the general store in Harlow Creek and knew everything that happened in the county within 48 hours of its happening. He rode north immediately. Eliza was standing on her new porch, the one she and Eli had rebuilt together, reading the papers that had apparently arrived by courier that morning. She looked up when he rode in. She was pale, but her expression was the same composed mask she wore when she was managing something difficult. "You heard," she said. "Sam Holt," he said, dismounting. She handed him the papers, and he read them standing in the cold morning air, his breath making small clouds. The survey description in the challenge was subtly but deliberately wrong. Someone had done careful work on it. "This was put together by someone who knows land law," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to go to San Angelo and counterfile. I need to get a proper surveyor to certify my actual boundaries before Prute can get one of his own out here to muddy the record." She paused. "I need to do this quickly, and I need money I have already allocated to winter supplies." He looked at her. "How much? Please do not," she said immediately. "Eliza, Eli, I am not going to take money from you." "It is not money," he said. "I have an account at the San Angelo Bank. I need to go there anyway at the end of the month to settle a cattle payment. I will go early and handle the business I need to handle, and you can come with me and fight this challenge. The only cost to you is 2 days of riding." She looked at him with a complicated expression that held gratitude and stubbornness and something else that was quieter and harder to name. "2 days of riding with you," she said. "I am very poor company," he said. "It will feel like less." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to one he had heard from her, a short, surprised exhale that caught him somewhere just below his ribs. "All right," she said. They rode to San Angelo together, 2 days south through cold November plains, camping the first night at a creek crossing where there was a stand of cottonwoods to break the wind. Eli had a bedroll and a canvas lean-to shelter, and she had her own wool blankets and a canvas bag of provisions. They made camp efficiently and without awkwardness, each handling their own portion of the work, and sat by the fire after eating and talked. They talked about things they had not yet gotten to in the weeks of working alongside each other on their neighboring properties. She told him about her favorite book, which was George Eliot's Middlemarch, and about how she had read it 3 times. He told her about the year before he came to Texas when he had worked as a surveyor's assistant and had learned more mathematics than he had ever expected to use, which turned out to be relevant when it came to building level foundations on uneven ground. She told him about the children she had taught in Fort Worth, a boy named Marcus who had arrived not speaking a word of English, and by the end of the year was reading independently, and the way she had felt watching him do it. Eli told her about Cedar, his horse, who had been with him since Missouri and who he trusted more completely than he trusted most people. She laughed at that, a real one this time, full and warm, and the sound of it opened something in the night air around them the way a window opens a room. He felt it physically. "I trust my mule more than most people too," she said. "I have named him Absalom. For the biblical figure, for the stubborn persistence," she said. "He and I understand each other." The fire crackled and the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and Eli became aware that he was happy. Not content, not comfortable, but actually happy, the kind that comes with warmth and company and feeling known. And the realization was so unexpected and so large that for a moment he could not speak at all. She was looking at the fire. He was looking at her. He looked away before she noticed. They arrived in San Angelo the next afternoon, and Eliza went directly to the county surveyor's office and argued her case with the clerk there with calm and absolute precision, laying out the correct boundary descriptions from the original county records, and pointing to the specific discrepancy in Pruitt's challenge documentation with the kind of methodical clarity that left the clerk very little room to maneuver. Eli went to the bank and then came back and stood in the doorway and watched her work, and he thought that he had rarely seen anyone do anything with such economical effectiveness. The clerk certified the counterfiling. The surveyor agreed to come north to Harlow Creek territory and certify the physical boundaries within the month. It was not the end of Pruitt's challenge, but it was the counter that made it defensible, and the clerk, who was a fair man, wrote notes in the margin of the file that would not help Pruitt's argument. They ate dinner in a San Angelo restaurant that evening, a real establishment with tablecloths and a menu written on a chalkboard, something neither of them had experienced in some time. She had a glass of red wine, and he had coffee, and they ate beef stew that was considerably better than anything either of them made at home, and they sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and the lamplight caught the color in her eyes, and he thought, quietly and irrevocably, that he was in love with her. He did not say it. He sat with it for the rest of dinner and on the ride back to camp at the edge of town, and lying in his bedroll looking up at stars, and he sat with the fear that came with it, which was not a small fear. He had loved Clara and lost her, and the loss had taken something from him that he was not sure had come back. He was not sure he could survive doing that again. But he also thought about what she had said in the doorway of her homestead the week before, about needing something to be hers. He thought about what she had told him at the county surveyor's office, not just the words but the manner of them, the steadiness and precision, and the way she never once appealed to sympathy or circumstance. She simply laid out the facts and made the argument. He thought about the voice he had first heard talking a mule back from panic, and he thought that some things were, perhaps, worth the risk. He slept. They rode home through gray December light, the plains around them dusted with frost that glittered when the sun broke through the clouds. She rode on his left side, which was where she had fallen naturally on the way out, and where she rode now as though it was a place she had always occupied. They talked less on the way back, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them had changed its character. It was comfortable now, occupied. It was the silence of two people who do not need to fill every moment with words, because the moments are sufficiently full as they are. At the fork in the road where his property and hers divided, they pulled up. The wind was cold and the sky above them was enormous and pale and full of moving clouds. "Thank you," she said, "for coming with me." "It needed doing," he said, which was true, but it was also not the only reason, and they both knew it. She looked at him for a moment in that direct, unhurried way of hers, and then she said, "Eli, I want to ask you something, and I would like you to answer honestly." "Always," he said. "Do you come to my homestead because of the fence and the water rights and the neighborly duty?" she asked. "Or do you come because you want to be there?" The cold wind came through between them and his horse shifted slightly under him, and he held her gaze without looking away because she deserved the honest answer, and because he was done lying to himself about it anyway. "Because I want to be there," he said. She looked at him for 3 long seconds. Then she said, quietly, "I am glad," and turned Absalom toward the North Fork and rode toward her homestead in the early winter light. He sat at the fork for a moment after she was gone, and then he pointed Cedar south and rode home, and he felt like the cold air was the cleanest thing he had breathed in 3 years. The surveyor came in mid-December and certified Eliza's boundaries precisely as the original county documentation described them, and his certification was filed in the county record, which effectively removed the legal basis of Pruitt's challenge. The Pruitt camp went quiet for a while after that, which Eli did not entirely trust, but the immediate threat was resolved. The week before Christmas, Eliza rode south to his homestead in the late afternoon with a tin of shortbread cookies that she had made, which she presented to him at his door with the straightforward information that she had made too many for herself, and he was the nearest available recipient. He ate one standing in the doorway. It was very good. He told her so and invited her in, and she stepped inside his house for the first time. It was not, he was suddenly aware, a welcoming space. It was clean because he was by habit a tidy man, but it was spare in a way that reflected 3 years of a person doing no more than the necessary minimum. There was a table and 2 chairs and a stove and a shelf of useful things, and almost nothing that was there for any reason other than function. She did not comment on it. She sat in one of the chairs at the table, and he made coffee, and she drank it without mentioning that it was bad, which was by now something of an established pattern between them, and they talked about the surveyor's visit, and about the winter preparations she still needed to complete, and about whether the January cattle prices in Abilene looked favorable. At some point she looked around the room slowly, taking it in without judgment, and then she said quietly, "Do you get lonely here?" He was at the stove. He turned and looked at her. "I used to think I had made peace with it," he said. "I have been revising that assessment." She held his gaze. There was a quality of courage in her, he thought, in the way she held space for honest things. She did not look away from difficult truths, she looked at them. "The assessment is probably worth revising," she said. "I think peace with loneliness and acceptance of loneliness are 2 different things." "Which one were you doing in Fort Worth?" he asked. "Acceptance," she said, without hesitation. "Which is why I bought land 11 miles from the nearest town and moved to the Texas Panhandle." The ghost of a smile. "Very sound logic." "The sourdest," he agreed, and she laughed, and the laugh filled his sparse, quiet house like light fills a dark room, and he thought, standing at the stove with a coffee cup in his hand, "I do not want to lose this. I cannot lose this." She stood to go when the light outside had gone fully blue with early winter dark, and he walked her to her horse and held Absalom's bridle while she mounted, a small courtesy she had initially waved off but had lately stopped protesting. She gathered the reins and looked down at him. "Come to supper on Christmas Day," she said. "I intend to make something that actually resembles a meal rather than fuel." "I would like that," he said. She rode off into the blue dusk, and he stood at his gate until the sound of her had faded, and the night cold came down properly around him. And then he went inside and sat at his kitchen table for a long time with the tin of shortbread and the late, quiet certainty of his own feelings, and he let himself be afraid of them for a while, and then he let himself be glad of them too. Christmas dinner at her homestead was a revelation. She had somehow, from a kitchen that was still in a state of rebuilding, produced roasted chicken and biscuits and a dried apple pie. She had found a pinon branch and set it in a jar on the table with a piece of red ribbon, which was the only decoration in the room, but it made the room feel like something had been given to it. She was wearing a deep green dress that he had not seen before, and her hair was down, pinned loosely rather than in the tight practical arrangement she wore for outdoor work, and she looked beautiful in a way that stopped his breath briefly when she opened the door. He had brought a bottle of good wine from Harlow Creek's small general store stock, and a jar of wild honey he had taken from a hive on his property in October, and she received both with genuine pleasure. They ate and talked and afterward sat by the small stove with glasses of wine and the fire warm at their feet and the cold pressing at the windows outside, and the conversation turned slowly, the way a river bends, from the comfortable and familiar into the deeper current of what was actually happening between them. "Tell me about Clara," she said. He looked at her and saw that the question was not invasive. It was offered as an opening, not a demand. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Whatever you want to tell me," she said. "I think she should not be a closed door between us." He was quiet for a moment, holding his wine glass in both hands. "She was gentle," he said. "Genuinely kind, the way that some people are built. She wanted the ranch and the land and the life we were building. She was excited about Thomas, enormously excited, even though the pregnancy was hard on her." He paused. "The fever took her before she had recovered properly from the birth. Thomas was 3 days old. He was small. He didn't have the strength." Eliza did not say anything for a moment. Then she said she would have loved this land. "Yes," he said, "she would have." "You are carrying her with you," Eliza said quietly. "I can see it. I do not mean that as a fault. I mean it as something to say clearly. I see it and it does not frighten me." He set his wine down on the small table beside him and looked at her carefully. This woman who had come into his life by way of a broken wheel and a mule she was talking back to calm. This woman with the steady voice and the amber eyes and the precise, courageous honesty. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said simply, as though she was answering a question he had not yet asked. He crossed the small space between their chairs and crouched down in front of her so that their faces were level, his elbows on his knees, and she looked at him without moving back, without dropping her eyes, meeting him entirely. "I have been trying to be careful," he said, "because I was afraid of what I felt and I did not want to offer you something that was broken." "You are not broken," she said. "You are grieved. Those are not the same thing." "No," he said, "they are not." He reached out and took her hand carefully, and she let him, and her fingers closed around his with a warmth that moved through him like the first real thaw after a long winter. "I love you," he said. "I have been lying to myself about it for months, and I would prefer to stop." She looked at him for a long, full moment, and her eyes were very bright in the firelight. "I love you too," she said. "I have been considerably more honest with myself about it than you apparently have been, which I will take as a point in my favor." He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first time he had laughed that completely since before Clara died, and it came up through him like something returning from a long way down. "That is absolutely a point in your favor," he said. She was smiling at him, fully and completely this time, the smile he had first seen the week after she arrived, that complete transformation of her face, and he thought he could look at it for the rest of his life and never grow accustomed to it. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently, and she kissed him back with the same unhurried certainty she brought to everything she did. Outside, the wind moved across the cold plains, and the stars above the Texas Panhandle were brilliant in the clear winter air. And inside the warm adobe house with its single pinon branch in a jar, two people who had been lonely for a long time held each other's hands and let the fire burn down without moving to add more wood. January was cold and busy, and full of the 100 daily urgencies of keeping livestock alive through a Texas Panhandle winter, which was not as severe as the winters of more northern territories, but had its own sharp teeth. They worked their separate properties through the days and came together in the evenings several times a week, sometimes at his homestead and sometimes at hers, and the rhythm of it settled into something that felt less like an arrangement and more like a life. She came to his place one evening in late January and found him at the table with survey maps and a legal document, which turned out to be the county assessor's notification that Pruitt had filed a second challenge. this one alleging that the original sale had been conducted without proper authority by the county official who signed it. Eli had already drafted a response, because Eliza had given him access to all her land documentation weeks ago, and when she read what he had written, she nodded and picked up the pen and made 3 changes, 2 of them improvements. "How do you know land law this well?" he asked. "I spent 4 months in the county land office in Fort Worth before I bought this property," she said, "learning everything I needed to know before I made the largest financial decision of my life." She set the pen down. "Pruitt is running out of grounds. This second challenge is weaker than the first." "It is," Eli agreed, "but he will keep going until it costs you more to fight him than to quit." "Then it will never stop," she said, "because I will never quit." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "We should go to the sheriff together," she said. "Not because I need you to speak for me, but because Aldous needs to understand that I am not isolated out here and that there is a pattern of harassment that he should be documenting." "He already knows about Pruitt," Eli said, "but you're right that a formal record is useful. I'll ride in with you on Thursday." They went to Aldous together on Thursday, and Jim Aldous, who was a weathered and largely fair-minded man of 50 who had been sheriffing this territory since 1868, listened to what they laid out and wrote it down carefully in his record book, and said that, while he could not prevent Pruitt from making legal filings, he could certainly note when a pattern of such filings appeared to constitute harassment, and that was a matter he would raise with the circuit judge at the spring sitting. Walking out of the sheriff's office into the cold January street, Eliza said, "That went well." "Better than it might have," Eli said. She stopped walking and looked up at him on the sidewalk of Harlow Creek's Main Street, which was a single block of wooden storefronts with a water trough and a hitching post and maybe 12 buildings total, and said, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it." "I would like us to get married," she said. He stared at her. She met his stare with her characteristic composure, though there was something in her eyes that was slightly more exposed than usual. "I am aware that it is unconventional for me to ask," she said. "But we are out here in the Panhandle in 1879, and unconventional seems appropriate. And also I have been waiting for you to ask, and you haven't." "I was working up to it," he said. "You have been working up to it for 2 months," she said. "I have evaluated the timeline and decided to assist." "You are the most managing woman I have ever met," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Do you have an answer?" He was looking at her on the wooden sidewalk of the smallest town in this part of Texas, in the cold January wind, and she was looking back at him with her amber eyes and her crooked-with-wind bonnet and her hands in her gloves, and that expression that was composed and certain and just slightly, just barely, hopeful, and he thought, "There is nothing in this world I would rather do." "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes." The composure broke into the full smile, and she took 1 step forward, and he closed the remaining distance and kissed her on the main street of Harlow Creek in front of Sam Holt's general store, and the 2 cowboys who were at the hitching post pretending not to watch. Sam Holt knew about it within an hour, and the territory knew about it within a week, which was simply how these things worked. They were married in March 1879 by the circuit preacher who came through Harlow Creek on his quarterly rounds. It was a small ceremony in the narrow wooden church at the edge of town. Eliza in a blue dress she had made herself, and Eli in his best coat with his dark hair finally properly cut. And the witnesses were Sam Holt and his wife Miriam and Jim Aldous, and a woman named Dolores Reyes, who had become something of a friend to Eliza in her trips to town. A Mexican-American woman who ran the laundry and who had a sharp eye and a warm laugh, and who had helped Eliza navigate the sometimes chilly reception she had gotten in certain quarters of the town, where a woman buying her own land and managing her own affairs was viewed with varying degrees of suspicion by varying degrees of neighbors. The injustices were there, running beneath the surface of life out here like caliche beneath the soil. Women could not vote or own property in the same terms as men in most of the nation, and while Texas land law had certain provisions that were more favorable than some states, Eliza had still navigated more obstacles and more deliberate resistance than any man buying the same piece of land would have faced. She had done it anyway, methodically and precisely, and without apology. Eli thought about this sometimes, about what it meant that she had to be this good to simply do what anyone should have been allowed to do, and it made him want to be careful about the ways in which he might inadvertently make things harder for her, even with good intentions. He thought he was mostly careful. She told him once, gently and directly, when he was not, and he listened and he changed, and she thanked him for that, and he thought that was probably what a good marriage looked like. The constant, daily work of truly hearing each other. After the ceremony, they rode back north together on a March day that was cold but full of the particular light of early spring, when the sky is washed and clear and the land is thinking about becoming green. They rode past the fork where their properties split, and Eli did not stop. He kept riding north toward her homestead. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Your house is better built than mine," he said. "Better preserved, better located relative to the water table. The wood I cut is already stacked there." She was quiet for a moment. "My house, our house," he said, "if that's agreeable." She was quiet a little longer, which he had learned to read not as uncertainty but as her processing something that had moved her. "It is agreeable," she said, her voice slightly lower than usual. He looked at her. Her eyes were bright. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand briefly, gloved in his gloved hand, and squeezed once. They rode the rest of the way north in the clean March light together. Spring came to the Panhandle in earnest, and with it, the full press of the work that kept their lives full from before dawn to after dusk. They planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the homestead, in the cleared ground that Eliza had burnt off in her first days here. They built a proper stable to replace the lean-to. They mended the south fence and added a section on the east where Eli's grazing land connected to hers, bringing the two properties into a single operational unit, even though they kept them as separate legal holdings, which had been Eliza's practical and legally savvy suggestion. Eli found himself more alive in this spring than he had been in 3 springs before it. There was something about working land when there was a reason that was larger than just surviving, that changed the quality of the work entirely. He came in from the field at midday to find her at the kitchen table with her land records and the seeds she was sorting for the next planting phase, and the sight of her there, in the house they were building together, with the light coming through the window she had fixed herself, and the coffee that was now considerably better because she had been teaching him, filled him with a fullness that was still slightly stunning in its completeness. Gerald Pruitt's third legal challenge arrived in April. It was dismissed by the circuit judge at the spring sitting, who noted in his ruling that the pattern of filings against this particular parcel appeared to constitute interference, and that further filings without new substantive grounds would be viewed with appropriate skepticism by the court. Jim Aldis rode north to tell them personally, which Eli took as a measure of the man's character. Eliza read the judge's ruling twice, carefully, and then folded it precisely and placed it in her land document box, and said, "Good." Pruitt did not file again after that. He pivoted to a different approach, which was to attempt to buy out a neighboring property to the east that would give him water access he had been seeking, and this proved enough to occupy his attention for the rest of the year. He was not a man who gave up entirely, but he was a practical man, and the Harte-Callaway position had become significantly more difficult and expensive to attack than it had been when Eliza was alone and new to the territory. The territory's other small injustices continued to run in the background of their lives. The way Dolores Reyes and her family were sometimes treated in Harlow Creek, with a contempt that had nothing to do with anything but their heritage. The way that the Comanche and Kiowa peoples whose land this had originally been were now confined to reservation life after decades of brutal displacement by the United States government. A history that pressed against the present whenever Eli rode across the wide plains and thought about who had known this land before him. He could not undo those things. He could be aware of them, and he could treat every person he encountered with the respect that every person was owed, and he tried to do that. He and Eliza talked about these things sometimes, in the evenings, which he found was one of the things he valued most about her. The fact that she did not flinch from difficult subjects, but engaged them directly and thoughtfully. Summer was hot and full and good. The cattle prices were better than expected. The garden produced well. And Eli and Eliza moved through their days with the particular kind of ease that comes not from life being simple, but from facing it with someone you trust completely. One evening in August, she came to find him at the corral where he was working with a young horse he was breaking for a rancher in Harlow Creek, and she stood at the fence and watched him for a while and then said, when he came to the rail, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her face. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were doing something particular, something held and careful and full of something large. "Tell me," he said. "We are going to have a child," she said. He stood at the corral rail and looked at her and felt something happen in his chest that was so large and so complex that for a moment he could not find the shape of it. There was joy, enormous and immediate. There was fear, also enormous and immediate, the same fear that had lived in him since 1875, the fear of loving something completely and losing it. He felt her watching him process all of it, and she did not rush him. He stepped over the fence rail and took her hands and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I saw the doctor in Harlow Creek today. He says I am healthy and everything is normal." "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked up at him with the full smile, the one that still undid him completely every time. "Yes," she said, "I am very happy. Are you?" "Yes," he said, and he pulled her into his arms and held her carefully and felt her arms come around him. And he pressed his face into her hair and breathed and let the joy be larger than the fear. They were happy through the fall and the winter, planning and preparing, moving the spare room around to accommodate a crib that Eli built from pine lumber, which took him 3 tries to get right, and which Eliza evaluated with honest and useful architectural feedback at each stage. She continued working throughout, which was simply her nature and not to be argued with, though he found himself quietly managing the heavy lifting in ways that were hopefully not too obvious. On a cold evening in February 1880, a boy was born in the homestead on the former Devereux land in the Texas Panhandle. The doctor from Harlow Creek was there, and Dolores Reyes was there, and Eli was there, holding Eliza's hand and talking to her quietly through the long hours of it. And when it was over and the baby was in her arms, red-faced and furiously vocal and absolutely perfect, Eliza looked up at Eli with a kind of radiant exhaustion that he thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Hello," she said to the baby in that voice, that steady, warm, unhurried voice. "Easy now. I am here." And the baby, impossibly, seemed to quiet slightly at the sound of it. Eli was sitting on the edge of the bed with his arm around her and his finger in the baby's tiny grip, and he thought about Clara and Thomas, held them in his mind for a moment, the grief real and present but no longer the largest thing in him, and he thought about how love does not replace loss but grows alongside it, how the heart is large enough for both. "His name," she said. "You choose," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the baby. "Samuel," she said, for the steadfastness of it. "Samuel Thomas Calloway." He was quiet. The Thomas. She had included Thomas without his asking. He pressed his mouth to her hair and did not try to speak. "All right," she asked. "Perfect," he said roughly. "Absolutely perfect." Samuel Thomas Calloway was a good-natured baby who grew into a bright-eyed toddler who showed an early and emphatic preference for being outdoors at all times and a strong interest in everything his father did with horses and everything his mother did with the garden and the land records, and the books she still kept on the shelf by the window. He was loud and cheerful and easily delighted and deeply attached to both of his parents, which was evident from the way he tracked whichever of them had left the room with an immediate and operatic concern. He was walking at 11 months and speaking in full sentences early, by 14 months, which his mother attributed to the fact that she talked to him constantly from birth, the same way she had talked to Absalom the mule, with the assumption that the listener was intelligent and worth addressing directly. Eli found this completely plausible and said so, which made her laugh. The ranch grew in the early years of the 1880s, Eli taking on an additional hand, a young man of 19 named Hector Vega who came from South Texas, and who was a capable and hardworking horseman, and who became in time something between an employee and a permanent member of the household. Hector was polite and diligent, and had the good sense to eat Eliza's cooking with the appreciation it deserved, and to work without complaint, and to ask questions rather than guess when he did not know how something should be done. Eli thought well of him from the first, and Eliza approved of him from the moment she saw him explain to young Samuel, who was by now 3 and deeply interested in horses, exactly how to approach a horse correctly so as not to startle it. "He will do," she said to Eli quietly. "He will do well," Eli agreed. The second pregnancy came in 1882, announced with the same composed directness as the first. This time a girl was born in November, small and fierce and dark-eyed, and they named her Clara Ruth. And when Eli held her for the first time in his hands that were so large around her small, warm weight, he cried quietly and without embarrassment, and Eliza held his arm and did not tell him not to. Clara Ruth grew into a child who resembled her mother in determination and her father in silence, a combination that produced a child who did not say much but who meant everything she said. By the time Samuel was 6 and Clara was 3, they were a matched pair of chaos and calm that kept the homestead lively in every season. The homestead itself had transformed significantly from the broken-down Devereux property that Eliza had arrived to find. The house had been expanded with a room added to the east side, properly built with good lumber and proper framing. The stable was solid. The kitchen garden was productive enough that they sold excess at the Harlow Creek market in summer. The water table had proven more reliable than Prute's people had suggested, which Eliza had apparently suspected from her own research before she bought the property. She had a map of the entire property on the wall of what served as her small office, marked with the water points and the soil tests and the grazing rotation she had worked out to keep the land from being overgrazed. Eli had made the same kind of detailed operational map for the southern portion they ran as pasture, and where the two maps touched, there were notes in both their handwriting, which he always noticed when he looked at it, the visual record of two people thinking together about a shared thing. In 1884, Prute died. It was not dramatic. He was 63 and had a heart that had apparently been failing for some time, and he died in his sleep in his large house outside Harlow Creek, and his operation was divided among his 2 adult sons, who had grown up in the territory, and who were, if not warm neighbors, at least rational ones who had no interest in their father's particular grievances. The territory breathed easier after that. Jim Aldis retired as sheriff in 1885 and came to the homestead to say goodbye before he moved to live near his daughter in Amarillo. He sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked with Eli and Eliza for 2 hours and called Eliza one of the most capable settlers he had seen come into this territory in his 17 years as sheriff, which was the kind of compliment that meant something coming from him because he was not a man who paid compliments lightly. "You built something real out here," he said, looking out at the land in the late afternoon light. "Both of you, something that will last." After he rode away, Eliza stood at the porch rail looking out at the land, and Eli stood beside her and put his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together over 6 years, the comfortable, occupied silence of 2 people who had made a life. "He is right," Eli said. "He is," she said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "I used to be so afraid that I had made a terrible mistake coming out here alone," she said. "Not afraid enough to turn back, but afraid." "I know," he said. "Were you ever afraid about us?" He thought about this honestly. "From the beginning," he said. "I was terrified from the first afternoon I saw you talking that mule back from Panic," she laughed. Of me specifically. Of caring about someone again, he said. Of wanting something to last. She turned to look at him. 6 years of marriage, and she still looked at him with the particular direct attention that had first made him feel seen in a way he had not expected. "But you did it anyway," she said. "You were very persuasive," he said. "That voice of yours." She raised an eyebrow. "My voice? I heard you before I saw you," he said. "You were talking to Absalom across the field. I heard you first." He paused, looking at her. "I had not heard a voice in a very long time." I had forgotten that a voice could sound like that. She was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" "Like it was worth listening to," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment with something full and warm in her amber eyes, and then she said softly, "I am glad you were close enough to hear it." "So am I," he said. "Every day." The children came running from around the side of the house at that moment. Samuel at 8, already his father's height for 6, and with Eliza's amber eyes and her habit of taking things apart to see how they worked, and Clara at 5, all dark hair and deliberate steps, holding something in her hands that turned out to be a jar with a lizard in it. "Mama," Clara said, holding up the jar, "I found him and I have named him Theodore." Eliza examined the jar gravely. "He seems healthy," she said. "You must let him go before dark." "I know," Clara said, entirely matter of fact. "I'm just showing him around." Eli crouched down to her level and looked at the lizard. "Theodore seems like a good name for a lizard," he said. Samuel was already at the corral gate, which had been his destination all along. "Papa," he called, "Hector says the roan has been limping on the left front. Can we look at it?" "After supper," Eli said. "Wash your hands first. They are not that dirty." "Samuel." "Yes, sir." This was life on the homestead in the Texas Panhandle in the mid-1880s. The children and the horses and the kitchen garden and the ledger books and the land maps and the coffee that was now reliably good. The cattle and the fence lines and the conversations on the porch in the evening after the children were in bed, when the sky was full of stars and the land was dark and quiet for miles in every direction. The third child came in 1886, a boy they named James, after no one in particular, but because it was a solid and straightforward name that suited him. And he was a different kind of child again, slower and more deliberate in his movements and his speech, inclined to sit in a patch of sunlight for extended periods and watch things with a quality of patient attention that reminded Eli sharply of Eliza, which made him love the boy with a particular and private fierceness. 3 children changed the scale of things considerably, and in ways that were practical and wonderful and exhausting in approximately equal measure. The house was full of noise and argument, and the particular joy that comes from being in a place where everything is alive and in motion. Hector, who was by now 25 and had developed from a hired hand into an indispensable part of the operation, had also taken a wife, a woman named Rosa from a family south of Harlow Creek, and they lived in the small house they had built on the eastern portion of the property, and Rosa and Eliza had formed a friendship that was warm and direct and beneficial to everyone around them. Eliza still kept her land records. She still had her map on the wall. She had added a second shelf of books since 1878, including several new volumes she ordered through Sam Holt's store, and she still read in the evenings with the focused pleasure of someone for whom reading was not leisure but necessity. She had begun in 1884, teaching a small informal school for the children on the neighboring ranches whose families could not make the 11-mile trip to Harlow Creek regularly, and this happened twice a week on the homestead's porch in summer and inside by the stove in winter, and she was very good at it, which surprised no one who knew her. Eli watched her teach sometimes from a distance, not intruding. He watched her explain the same thing 3 different ways to 3 different children, because she understood instinctively that every mind worked differently, and that the goal was understanding, not the performance of understanding. He watched her wait patiently, while a child worked something out, without jumping in to give the answer, which was the hardest part of teaching, and which she did with the same quality of purposeful restraint that characterized everything she did. He thought about what she had said on that first day at the fork in the road about needing something to be hers because she was capable, and she wanted that to count for something. He thought about how much it counted. He thought about how the world was structured in ways that had consistently underestimated her, and how she had consistently, methodically exceeded every low expectation that had been set for her, and how she did it without bitterness, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing. In 1887, the year Eli turned 40 and Eliza turned 36, they had a stretch of difficult months. The summer was drier than usual, and the creek that fed their eastern pasture ran low in July and August, which put pressure on the cattle and required significant work to manage the water carefully. They were stretched thin, financially and physically, for a season, and there were hard evenings when they sat at the kitchen table with the ledger, and the numbers were close, and the conversation was serious and honest about what would need to be cut or sold. They got through it. They sold a portion of the cattle herd to keep the numbers manageable relative to the water supply and brought in enough to cover the shortfall and hold through to the fall rains, which came in September and brought the creek back up. By October they were stable again, and the cold weather that followed was welcome after the long dry summer. "We held it," Eliza said one October evening, closing the ledger after entering the final numbers of the recovery. "We held it," Eli agreed. She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm on her face. In 11 years of knowing her, 6 years of marriage, he had learned her face so completely that he could read every gradation of her expression, and what he saw now was something deeply and quietly satisfied. Not triumphant, satisfied. The particular satisfaction of having done a hard thing correctly. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I was not sure when I came out here that I was doing the right thing," she said. "I was sure that I needed to do it, and I was sure that I was capable of it. But there were many times in that first year when I was not sure that it was going to work." She paused. "And then you came over that rise on your horse and stood in the road and helped me fix my wheel, and everything was different after that, though I did not know it yet." He was quiet, watching her. "I just wanted to say that," she said. "That everything that is good in my life now began with you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "And mine with you," he said. "Long before I admitted it," she smiled, the full one. Even now it still transformed her face, still caught him off guard with its completeness. "I could hear your voice from across the field," he said. "I had not heard another voice in a very long time, and yours was. It was the first thing I had heard in years that made me think there was something worth coming back to." She squeezed his hand. "We both came back," she said. "We did," he said. Outside, the October wind moved across the Panhandle plains, and the stars were brilliant in the cold, clear sky above the land that was theirs, that they had built together, that had held them through the years, and would hold them for the years to come. Inside the house, with its maps on the wall, and its books on the shelf, and its 3 sleeping children, and its kitchen full of the smell of the day's baking, Eli and Eliza sat at their table with their hands together, and let the evening be quiet around them. In the years that followed, the homestead continued to grow and deepen into exactly the kind of life that each of them had needed before they knew they needed it. Samuel grew into a young man of remarkable skill with horses, which surprised no one, and at 17 was already working alongside his father with the easy competence of someone who had been absorbing knowledge since before he could articulate it. Clara developed her mother's precise intelligence and her father's patience, and seemed likely to be a teacher herself someday, or perhaps a woman who did something that nobody had thought to do before, which also seemed possible. James remained the quiet, sunlit, observant one, the child who said little but noticed everything, who at 10 years old produced a detailed and accurate sketch of the property's water sources entirely from memory that left his mother looking at it for a long time with an expression Eli had learned to read as deep and private pride. The community around them changed as the years moved through the 1880s and into the 1890s. Harlow Creek grew slightly, adding a second store and a proper schoolhouse, which meant that Eliza's twice-weekly porch school wound down as families had better access to formal education, which she regarded as entirely the right outcome. Hector and Rosa had children who played in the yard with Eli and Eliza's children. Dolar's Raises Laundry became a proper establishment with 2 employees and Dolar's eldest daughter helping run it, and Dolar's herself was a permanent fixture at the homestead's table on Sunday afternoons, which had become the standing tradition of the years. Eli's hair went gray at the temples. Eliza's had threads of silver in the chestnut by the time she was in her early 40s, and she wore it with the same composed lack of vanity that she had always brought to her appearance. He thought she was more beautiful as the years went by, which he told her, and she looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and warmth and said, "You are extremely partial," and he said, "Entirely," and meant it completely. He thought about the afternoon in September 1878 when he had been crouching at the water trough and heard a voice across the field, and about how close he had come to retreating into his barn and not walking toward it. He thought about that road-edge moment sometimes, the particular narrowness of it, the chance of it, how everything had pivoted on the fact that he had walked toward a sound instead of away from it. He was glad, every single day, that he had walked toward it. On a September evening in 1892, 14 years after the afternoon, a wagon lost its wheel on the road below his property. Eli Calloway sat on the porch of the homestead with his wife, their children long since in from the day's work, supper done, the low night sounds of the Panhandle plains around them and the first stars beginning to show in the east. They had coffee. There was a jar of late summer wildflowers on the porch railing that Clara had put there. "September," Eliza said. "September," he agreed. She turned to look at him with the particular attention she had been looking at him with for 14 years, the direct and warm consideration that had never become less present or less precise. "Do you know what today is?" 14 years since I heard your voice across a field," he said. She looked at him with surprised pleasure. "You remembered." "I remember everything about that day," he said. "The light, the dust from the road, the sound of you talking to Absalom before I could see you." She was quiet for a moment, smiling to herself. "Easy now," she said softly, imitating herself. "Easy now," he repeated, and the words, which had been the first words he had ever heard her say, settled between them in the September evening with 14 years of everything they had built around them. "They were very good words," he said. "They still are." She leaned against him on the porch bench, her shoulder against his, and looked out at the land with him, the land she had come to alone and made hers and then theirs, the land that had held them through the heat and the cold and the dry years and the full ones, the land their children had grown up on, and that would still be here long after any of them were. "I was not easy, though," she said, with a dry and private humor, "to be very accurate about it." "No," he agreed. "You were not easy. You were exactly what I needed." She turned and kissed him, unhurried, with the same warm certainty she had brought to everything for 14 years. He held her close in the September dark and let the night be large around them. Above them, the Texas sky turned deep blue and then black and filled with stars. The same enormous, indifferent, beautiful sky that had looked down on this land for longer than any human grief or human joy. And below it, on the porch of a homestead that 2 people had built together from the ground up, from a broken wheel and a woman's voice and a man who had been lonely long enough, everything was fully, completely, irrevocably whole.